Good morning, everyone. My name is Shan Zhou. So thanks a lot for the nice introduction from Dr. Greenbell. And here's some overview of my CV education background. And I want to explain a little bit more with this program. So it was a joint European Commission master's program. And I got to travel very intensively across 4 different European countries. And especially I spent half a year in Lund University in Sweden, where I got a master in environmental management with a specialization in industry ecology and corporate environmental management. So basically this is me. For today's job talk, I will be speaking about the sustainable energy transition process in the US. So I will use smart meter development as an empirical example to examine the effects of multi-level environmental governance on the energy transition process. And my findings show that it's the interdependency between policy actions that actually shape the policy outcome and also the technology development. So for most of the time of this job talk, I will focus on this paper. And I will also discuss my pipeline research interest and how my research can be related to the Glean faculty member and also the SRE program. And in the end, I will discuss some of my teaching interests that relate to the Glean College. So first of all, why should we care about the energy infrastructure or the energy sector? The very quick answer is because the current electric grid system that we have in the US and in most of the developed countries are failing. There are a lot of the challenges that we face in the 21st century which cannot be addressed by this aging and increasingly outdated infrastructure. For example, the air pollution, climate change, emergency management, energy security, and urban sustainability issues. And particularly for climate change, the energy sector in the US is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. So in order to address these challenges, a lot of people have called for the revolution in the energy sector or transformation from the traditional power grid system to a smarter grid system or a modernized electric grid system. And for the traditional power grid system, it's a very centralized system, heavily based on fossil fuel electricity generation, and there's very limited flexibility regarding the type of technology you used or the capability in response to natural disasters. But for the smart grid system, it includes a more diverse set of electricity generation technology, and most of them are very low carbon intensive, such as wind, solar, fuel cell, geothermal, so on and so forth. And it's also coupled with energy storage devices to better prepare for emergencies. And some people call the smart grid as an integration of the information and communication technology with the energy industry. So there is a lot of the built-in components, the digital components in the electric grid system. So the goal is to enhance the resilience, the intelligence, and the sustainability of the energy sector. And one central piece of the technology in the smart grid system is called the advanced metering infrastructure, or the smart meters, AMI meters. And from the name, you can tell it's smarter. It's definitely different from the traditional analog meter that we have. So smart meters can record and store real-time energy consumption information and then transfer the information back to utility companies. And also, utility companies can send price information or energy alert information to the customers. So this allows this two-way communication between energy consumers and utility companies. And there are a lot of the benefits associated with the smart meters because a lot of the components are automated, so it saves money, the operational cost associated with the meter reading. It also improves the emergency management experiences. And more importantly, the smart meter is considered as the foundation of the smart grid, because after you have the smart meter installed, then you can go for the other modernized energy services, such as dynamic electricity pricing, or energy efficiency program, or the distributed renewable energy program. And this is why I choose the smart meter as an empirical example to understand the energy transition process in the US. So this is a geographical distribution of the technology in the US in 2015. And we still see a large variation in terms of the penetration rates after 10 years deployment of this technology in this country. A lot of the orange states in the West and in the South, they are doing particularly well, with over half of the meters already replaced by smart meters. And we also see a lot of the blue states. Ohio is doing okay, we are kind of in the middle. And still some of the states in gray or light blue color, which indicates that not so much is going on. So what's happening behind this? I am very interested in understanding the dynamics and trying to identify the determinants that can explain the different rates and speed for technology development in the low energy transition process. And as a policy scholar, I want to approach this from a public policy perspective, trying to understand the complication of the energy governance and the role of that on the energy transition process. So this is a very simple sketch of the governance regime for smart meters. And we can see that utility companies are often the deployer or the implementer or even the owner of the smart meters. And they are closely regulated by policies, regulations adopted at the state level, and most of them are closely regulated by state public service commissions. And for smart grid technology, the US federal government has made one of the largest public investment in the world through the Recovery Act. So a larger amount of public funding was transferred to utility companies directly to help reduce the technology cost and promote the technology penetration. So, and you can see that there's no single authority that is responsible for the technology rollout, right? There's no like a leading department or ministry, and this is very different from a lot of the European cases, while they have designated single department or ministry that is responsible for the technology rollout in the nation. And how to understand the divided authorities in this energy transition process, and what's the role of this divided authority on technology development become a very important question if we want to design more effective governance regime to promote the low carbon energy transition. So we now can take a look at the literature, the recent development in the literature regarding the development in the energy governance topics. And there is an emerging trend, like the scholar leading by Sovacool and his colleagues, they are arguing that it's important to understand the energy governance from a polycentric perspective, because when you think about the energy infrastructure, it often covers a large geographic area. Look at the transmission line. And the boundary of the technology is often not overlapping with the political boundary. So you have different authorities regulating the same topic, and you have policies adopted at different levels doing the same thing. And this is exactly what we see in the smart meter case, right? Divided authority among multiple government actors. And some of the scholars are particularly worried about this divided authority because when there's no clear government intervention, and this can create a chaotic process for the technology development. And then I found another group of literature particularly useful, which is the multi-level environmental governance literature. This is also closely related to the environmental federalism literature, which look at the tension between state and federal policy design and implementation, And there have been empirical evidence, especially in environmental economics, right? People look at the positive or problematic outcome between state and federal policy implementation, especially we have evidence for the automobile fuel efficiency standards with the federal CAFE standard. We also have some evidence with the business green innovation policies. And there has been increasing discussion in the federalism challenges in the energy policy area, in energy efficiency, the interstate renewable energy transmission, and green building codes. So for this study, I want to revisit the multi-level environmental governance with this new and high-quality technology and policy development data in the smart grid field. And there are two research questions that's guiding this paper. The first one is purely empirical or the practical research question. How can we explain the different rate and levels of technology deployment across the US states? And this has a lot of implications for the technology diffusion or the sustainable technological change literature. And the second one is the one that I want to link with the policy theory. So with a diverse set of government actions taken at different levels, how can we better understand their working together and how their interaction influence the final sustainable energy transition process? So the research design of this paper, I move away from a focus on a single policy instrument, and I try to focus on a policy mix or a combination of policy instruments. And by doing that, the goal is to have a more holistic understanding of the policy context. And I consider the smart meter development as a policy outcome. So it's a quantitative study. My dependent variable is the smart meter penetration rates at the state level. So basically, it's the percentage of smart meters out of all the electric meters in a state. So I focus on two groups of independent variables. First one is the governance variable. The second one is the social contextual factors. And next, I will explain how I operationalize each of them. The first government level that I look at is at the federal level. So the federal financial incentive through the Recovery Act. The Smart Grid Investment Grant from the Recovery Act has appropriated about 4.5 billion matching funds to utility companies, and over 100 utility companies all over the country has been awarded with this public investment. So the hypothesis is that the federal funding from the Recovery Act can both have direct and also indirect effects to stimulate the state technology development. And I use the per capita amount of the smart grid investment grant funding allocated to each state as an indicator for the federal level financial incentive. And the second governance level that I look at is the state. And there is much more variation in terms of the type of policies adopted at the state level and also the number of policies adopted. So I visited the website of Public Service Commission and the state legislature, and I have an inventory of policies that are related to smart meter and smart grid deployment for each state. And I categorize those policies into two types. The first one is the smart meter promotion policy. I call it promotion policy because it's not like what a lot of the European countries are doing. They have mandatory or binding smart meter rollout target. For the US states, most of them, I think all of them, as far as I remember, all of them have policies that indicates, okay, is the state intent to develop smart grid. So the state encourages that utility companies go ahead and invest in this technology. And that's why I called it promotion policy, or you can say it's an encouragement from the state government. And the second type of policy is called the smart meter data and privacy policy. As I mentioned before, the smart meter is all about real-time energy consumption data. So it's a huge amount of data that can be installed in different locations of the grid. When you look closer at this type of data, you can tell whether someone is at their home or not, what they are doing in a particular time period, whether you are going out for a long vacation or something like that. So this can be scary, right? If some criminals get this type of data, they can easily choose the time to break in your house. So this has created some public concerns regarding the data security and privacy issues. And some states go ahead and regulate this part. So who has access to the data, who has the ownership of the data, at what circumstances can utility companies share the data with the third party. So this group of policy is the data and privacy policy. And in order to take into account the policy density, I use the cumulative policy counts as an indicator for the state policy activity. And I can explain a little bit more using this snapshot of the data set. So you can see for Ohio, in 2007, we adopted one policy to promote the smart meters. So it's coded as 1 for this variable. And we also adopt another one in 2008. So the cumulative number of that policy become 2 in 2008. And there's no activity after that, so it's coded as 2 in all the following years. And for Ohio, we don't have anything for the privacy or the data security issues. And if you compare that with California, as always, they are like the leading or the pioneering states in the country. They have a lot of more policy activities in these two areas, right? So the hypothesis here is as states adopt more policies to regulate the smart meter technology development, it kind of indicates a more favorable policy environment, and this will drive the state smart meter penetration. Okay, and the next government body that I look at is the Public Service Commission. So a majority of the customers, the electric customers in the US, are served by the investor-owned utility companies. And from the number of the smart meters installed by utility, you can see investor-owned utility companies actually are responsible for over 80% of this technology. So most of these this group of utility companies are closely regulated by public service commissions regarding their daily investment, their electricity rate setting, and also their daily operation. So we can also think about the Public Service Commission as having 2 goals. First one is trying to balance. The first one is trying to have the electricity price, make sure that electricity price is set as a reasonable and fair level. And the second one is to ensure that the energy service is reliable and efficient. So how they balance these 2 goals involves a lot of policy uncertainty, because every time when investor-owned utility companies, they want to make some investment, they have to send out proposals to the Public Service Commission and then get approval for the utility rate increases to recover the project cost. So how Public Service Commission interpret the cost recovery rule can involve great uncertainty for utility to make new investment in the grid. And a lot of the energy consulting company has evaluated these type of risks faced by utility companies. And in this study, I used the SNL Energy's Public Service Commission ranking as an indicator for that. So they basically rate all the public service commissions in the US almost every year. And according to the commissioner profile, their rate cases, decisions. So this ranking has 9 categories, from above average 1 to below average 3. So I coded above average 1 as having the least level, the lowest level of policy uncertainty, which indicate which correspond to a more favorable policy environment for utility investment. And below average 3 is the highest level of policy uncertainty. So the hypothesis here is the higher level of policy uncertainty, the lower level of smart meter development. And the policy interaction terms. So this is the most interesting and most important part for this paper. I would think, I argue that the state policy can serve as an important policy environment, and this policy environment can influence the effects of public funding and also the Public Service Commission rules. And here I only consider the internal interaction, so I only consider the policy interactions in the area of smart meter and smart grid. And I include 3 policy interaction terms, the one between federal funding and state promotion policy, the one between Public Service Commission, regulatory uncertainty, and promotion policy, and also interaction between the 2 types of state smart meter policies. And the hypothesis is that it's this multi-level policy interaction that's play a very important role in the technology diffusion process. And besides the governance factor, I also include a bunch of the social contextual factors. There is a rich literature in this social acceptance of technology innovations, because how social groups perceive the technology can greatly influence how the technology was adopted by different people. So I identify 3 groups. The first one is energy consumers. So they are the user of the smart meters. So I want to test whether there's any difference in technology adoption across the different income groups. And the second one is the environmental interest groups. So pressures from the environmental NGOs might influence the technology development process because it's considered as an environmentally friendly technology. And the third one is the high-tech sectors. So because of the great interest with the data management and data analysis with the smart meter and smart grid, there might be great interest from the high-tech sector in this technology development. I also include a factor that measures the technological pressure. There is the study by Smith and his colleague, which arguing that there can be pressure from the internal of the technological system that influence the transformation of the system and the adoption of the new technology. So I include the level of energy efficiency and distributed renewable as the 2 indicators to measure the condition of the electric grid system. And for data and methods, I collected a panel data sets for all the states and DC in the US from 2007 to 2012. And I estimated fixed effects models using data. Most of the data were drawn from the Energy Information Administration, the Census Bureau, and Bureau of Economic Analysis. So I have 2 model specifications here. The first model is the basic model without policy interaction terms, so basically all the individual policy variables in this one. And for model 2, this is the one that I introduced the policy interaction terms. And this is the summary of the whole model. I've talked about these 2 groups of variable. And for control variables, I control for electricity prices in each state, and I also control for the yearly the time trend, the yearly dummy variable. Ideally, I should include the cost information for this technology because usually technology adoption is sensitive to the technology prices. But this type of data is not available at the state level, so I just include the time trend to control for the general pattern for technology development over time. So these are the results. For Model 1, without policy interaction terms, you can see that the coefficient, estimated coefficient for federal funding and Public Service Commission regulatory uncertainty are significant. This indicates that a higher level of federal funding and a lower level of policy uncertainty by the Public Service Commissions can promote the smart meter deployment. We don't see any significant results for the state level smart meter policies, which is kind of surprising. And we also, I don't find any significant results for the social contextual variables. And these results do not change much. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Just clarification, the adoption is purely residential?
It's at the state level. So
is it residential or commercial?
It's all everything. Yeah, residential, commercial, and industry.
You're not able to distinguish those two?
Sometimes because the data for industry and commercial is very, how to say, the number, it's minimal compared to the residential sector. So I didn't distinguish between these. So the impact of the different social contextual factors do not change much after I introduce the policy interaction terms. And this indicates very limited influence from the social interest groups. And the majority of the impacts are from the government interventions. And for Model 2, after I introduce the policy interaction terms, the main effects of the individual policy variables become insignificant. And you can see that policy interaction terms are significant. And this indicates that the effects of federal funding and Public Service Commission regulatory uncertainty are both dependent on the state level smart meter promotion policy. And also, the two types of state smart meter policies are dependent on each other. And it can be misleading to just look at the magnitude and the significance for the interaction terms. So I plotted the interaction terms out using the standardized regression coefficient. And you can see for the red line, this indicates a high level of state commitment to smart meters, and the black line is a lower level. So when the federal funding increases from low to high, you can see the response, the Y variable actually increases in both cases. But it increases more dramatically in the red line case when there's a higher level of smart meter promotion policy adopted by the state. And we see a very similar interdependent relationship between the role of Public Service Commission and state smart meter promotion policy. It is dependent on the level of state policy activity. And as states adopt more policies, which is the red line, the slope of or the effects of Public Service Commission regulatory uncertainty become more negative, right? This is the change from the black to the red line. And when we look at the interaction between the two state smart meter promotion state policies, we can see that in the case of the black line, while there's not so much commitment to smart meters by the state government, regulating the data and privacy policy issues can have a negative or preventive impacts on smart meter development. Well, it makes sense to follow the red line while you have these two policies go hand in hand. So what does this tell us? A final takeaway message from this analysis, from this fixed effects models analysis is, we can see that the smart meter development process in the US has been dominantly driven by the government interventions. Definitely the government policies are more important than the influence of social impact groups And these are also very different from a lot of the European countries. And also I found that it's the interdependency between the policy actions that actually are influencing the technology diffusion process. So some of the policy implications can flow from the results. As we are dealing with this very complicated energy transition process, it could be having a very big challenge to devise an effective policy framework to address this issue. And the results shows that simply focusing on relying on one policy level or policy scale can be problematic because a large part of the policy effects works through the policy interaction. And second, it can also relate to the regulatory safety net argument. So when we have multiple decision-making points in the system, you can have, that means you receive attention or regulatory resources from different actors, right? And this can indicate that, especially if based on the results, I find that it's the coupling between policy actions that's creating or shaping the policy changes. So having a multi-level governance regime for the energy transition can create a beneficial or positive outcome in this case. So there are some directions for future research. For example, the first one that I thought about is the relationship between the federal funding and state smart meter promotion policy. There is the concern that state only adopt the smart meter promotion policy in response to the stimulus funding. And this can be a very interesting topic to examine in the future to look at how the sequenced policy adoption influence the technology development and what are the indirect effects of the stimulus funding on the market and also on the policy adoption side. And the second one is this is a purely quantitative analysis, so it would be nice to complement this study with qualitative analysis using case studies, interviews, or surveys to talk with the utility companies to see what they really think about the different policies from different government actors, why they want to adopt the technology, and why don't they adopt the technology, something like this. And the next one is about technology in place versus technology in use. When I measure the smart meter penetration rates, it's only an indicator of the technology in place. So you have the technology. But the more important question is what's the percentage of the smart meters that have been used by customers in the dynamic electricity pricing or the energy efficiency programs. And this has a greater implication for us to evaluate the environmental impacts from the grid modernization process and also the carbon footprint reduction from the grid modernization. So those are some of the directions or ideas for future research. And some of my pipeline research projects are extension from this smart meter diffusion paper. So I have one paper that I will present at APAN, and it's also almost ready for applied energy, which I use the ArcGIS to geographically map the technology penetration at the utility level using the utility service boundary maps. And I link this utility level technology penetration data with the census tract level demographic data to see what are the social justice concerns with the technology development. And this has great implication for us to evaluate the impacts, like how vulnerable groups, how the poor can whether they can be harmed in natural disasters or other emergency cases, because there is evidence saying that a lot of the federal recovery funding has been allocated in the rich communities. So And another project that I'm working on is using the same geospatial analysis approach to evaluate the environmental justice and green schools. What is the distribution of the green schools in our neighborhood? And my co-author, who is an environmental scientist, she's also doing some experiments to test the difference in air quality in the LEED certified buildings and non-LEED buildings. So this study, the next step for this study is to trying to link the air quality data with the social justice, the distribution of the green schools, and to see what are the public health impacts of that. And another project that I'm working on is at the local level. So this smart meter diffusion paper is purely at the state and federal level. And aggregating the data to the state level can mask a lot of the variation at the bottom level. So I have a project that look at how city government collaborate with different types of utility companies and how the different types of collaboration influence the technology development and also policy adoption. And another project that I'm working on is for the Chinese cities. We just completed the data collection process for this one. We want to identify the determinants that can explain the provision of urban amenities and public infrastructure in over 600 Chinese cities. And the next step for this one is to develop resilience and sustainability index scores for the Chinese cities. So I think that's very exciting. And the last area that I'm working on is about the policy process theories. And I have a paper that's currently under review at Policy Studies Journal, which look at how external forces influence the first time and subsequent policy adoption in the renewable energy field. And in particular, I look at the impact of coercive power from the EU Commission and also emulation from the neighboring countries, competition effects from the economic peers in renewable technology development, and the last one is the learning effect by participating in intergovernmental organizations. So the next step is try to use the feed-in tariff data and to try to code the magnitude and the direction for the policy changes. And another project related to the policy theory is to look at the relationship between policy goals and policy design. And we are using the net metering policy as an empirical example for this. So this is an overview or summary review of my research agenda. You can see that my research sits at the intersection of public policy, infrastructure technology, and sustainability. And I see a lot of the overlapping research interest with the Glenn College faculty members, such as environmental energy policy, urban planning, local and state government policy, policy analysis, science and technology policy, as well as social justice. And I also see a lot of collaboration opportunities with the SRE program. For example, I'm particularly interested in the food, energy, water nexus. Actually, I have collected data regarding the renewable energy development and the water consumption in the Chinese provinces. So it would be nice in the future to continue working in that area. And for smart and resilient communities, I'm very interested in the smart city topic, smart grid, the environmental impacts of the smart grid. And for ecosystem services, I want to extend the current geospatial analysis that I'm working on and to turn that as an advantage in the future, try to combine the remote sensing data and more geospatial analysis to see what are the ecosystem responses to climate policy, especially responses to the carbon markets. And for the circular economy, as I mentioned before, I have a degree in environmental management, especially in industry ecology. So it would be nice to pick it up in the future to analyze more, to study more about the green economy and similar topics. And in the end, I want to talk about my teaching interest in the Glenn College. I'd be happy to teach a lot of the core courses in public policy or public affairs. I can also teach the methods class. I was trained as a quantitative person, and I also have already taught one quantitative core course for undergraduates at SPIA IUPUI. And for specialty, I can teach a lot of the environmental and energy policy courses or courses in sustainable governance. And I'd also be happy to teach the required course by the college. For example, the regulation and privatization, business and government relationship. And I know there are some opportunity to co-teach course with other SRE faculty member. Maybe in the future, I would also be happy to do that. Okay, so that's all for my research projects and teaching interest. I'd be happy to take any question you have. And thank you so much. Actually, I want to just add one more thing to your question, because I think the reason that I didn't differentiate between the sector is a lot of the observation do not have are coded as 0. So by aggregating the residential industry and commercial sector, you have more numbers of the adoption of the technology that has adopted by the utility or by the states. So not so many zeros in the data sets can improve the modeling results somehow.
Presumably you could look at the policies, the state level instruments, and distinguish if they are residential targeting or industry targeting. I guess what other than the question of what the data was, it's to then say if you had any sense of the proportion of adoption, and if, for example, it's more commercial, what role does the socio-demographic variable control play in that?
That's a very interesting point. I guess for the policies per se, they do not distinguish, like the effects are not distinguished among the different sectors. But you are right, it can be very interesting to see how the social contextual factors have different influence across, especially the high tech.
The ARA funding isn't individual based, as I understand it.
Which one?
The ARRA isn't an individual consumer level.
But it's all distributed through utility companies, and it's the utility company who are deciding which sector they want to go. Yeah, but that's a great point.
Yes, I thought you cast the net very broadly, and that was a good way to come at the task you had. But a couple of cautions and a couple of remarks, if you will. One is your initial slide talks about the failure of the current grid. I think that's too strong a word, how the grid has failed. You want to say it's not optimal or something.
Right.
To assert that all these decades of what we've done in electric power grid has failed is, I think, too strong a term. Then more broadly, the smart grid idea is partly a big marketing notion. It's just what do you want, dumb grid? Smart grid. The trouble is that regulatory systems especially are designed not to advocate and promote, but to regulate. Indeed, it's probably wrong-headed to think that you can promote and regulate at the same time. We found that doesn't work very well. And another related point is that, the smart grid idea is just something that engineers love. I mean, these are the people that built erector sets when they were kids. And so on. And so it's kind of a certain faddism involved with this. Not to say that it's not a good idea, metering especially, metering. But remember that it's a very promotional matter. And so as a scholar, I think you have to be careful not to become a raw advocate of this technology. It's kind of fun, and engineers enjoy it. And then finally, the cost of this. Even if you invest and do it in smart grid, in smart metering, you've got to find a way to see to it that the utilities don't scarf off all the additional revenues from that, and it doesn't get reflected in the consumers, because presumably your efficiency argument means lower cost to somebody. And if it's a lower cost to the utilities, as it's supposed to be, that needs to get translated into lower cost to customers. That's where good regulation comes in. So I'd just offer those observations to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very good insight.
I had a question about your data policies, and I like the way you characterize this. That really is the merging of IT and utility industries. And property rights, access to information means money. And so I'm wondering to what extent good or bad data policies really make a difference towards innovation, because if you give consumers the rights or some property rights over that, then there's going to be limitations on how much value they can get out of that, out of selling that information. So I'm wondering, maybe the operationalization of that particular variable, is it like a 1-0?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, because then that kind of rules out some utilities may be public service commissions might be very favorable to companies and say, go for it, capture all of that value out of the property rights. We don't really care much about the property rights as consumers versus others. And I was looking at your distribution of states there. Some of them are quite progressive, but not necessarily maybe interested in property rights as citizens, but maybe not so technologically innovative. So it might make a difference. I don't know. Do you think? I mean, how do these data policies vary over time? Do they not vary over time, but how do they vary in terms of
the states
versus consumers? Are they pretty much the same, or do they vary in any way?
You mean across the different states? Yeah. Yes. Some of the states, they only have data and privacy policies. They don't have any promotion policy. For example, Oklahoma, as far as I know. So it shows kind of the different concern of the state government. And you can see when states just go for the data and privacy policy, they can be more risk averse. They are more skeptical about the technology, so they want to first set up the boundary, say, okay, you can do this and that. You have to protect the consumer from the potential risks associated with the technology. And some other states are more aggressive. They don't have anything like Ohio. I wouldn't say Ohio is aggressive, but we don't have any data and privacy policy, but we do have. It's the state intent to develop the technology without looking at the privacy issues. So there is this type of variation.
Yeah, I was just asking the variance within the data policies. Okay.
I can check that later with the descriptive statistics. Yes.
I was wondering, it seemed like the promotion policies played an important part in your analysis and the results. So given that you've got this variation over states and over time, have you thought about whether there's an opportunity for any kind of quasi-experimental design where you might do a treatment and control and then like a second treatment on to kind of tease out some of those interactions that you were interested in? Because of course you worry about the endogeneity of the policy in the kind of setup that you're doing unless you think the fixed effects completely control for that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, I don't have a very quick answer for the type of the quasi-experiment design that you ask, but I think with regard to the role of the state-level policy, a very interesting finding from this research is their effects is not direct on the technology development, because the direct effects are insignificant in both models. And they are only effective through working through the federal funding and also Public Service Commission. So this is kind of very interesting thing that I can see. Yeah.
It just seems like for that reason, there might be some good opportunity.
Right. Yeah.
Treatment control kind of stuff.
That would be very interesting to explore. I think I have him waiting there.
I don't remember your table results very well,
Mhm.
but I remember that you made a comment about maybe social or political variables not being significant.
Yeah.
And you were being surprised. I was actually relieved for you that they weren't. Because my interpretation of your results is just federal funding was effective contingent on the policy environment in states. That's my interpretation. And I think that's the only part where the research design is clean. With those other variables, I mean, they explain the policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you found them to be significant, there's something weird going on, right? They should be able to explain the policy change beforehand. Is that right?
That's a very good point. Actually, you see the inclusion of social interest group in policy adoption or policy diffusion literature a lot. The reason that I include this in this study is there is also in the technology diffusion study, another group of scholars, they try to see the social acceptance or the social conflicts between the technology and the users or the different interest groups. So it's a bit different from the political process that you are talking about. Actually, in the robustness checks that I did a bunch of robustness checks. I also tested the state ideology variable. That's a very important political variable that we include in policy diffusion that try to explain the adoption of policy. And that one is not significant. So my explanation for that is because a lot of the policy variables that I include already covers the information,
Right. Yeah.
right? But for that's a very interesting point though. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So I want to follow up on Doug's question, but make a quick comment about your comment.
Mm-hmm.
I've reviewed papers that have done quasis, and it's really hard with 50 states to get enough sample. So the sample size issue is really hard for a quasi.
Yeah. I would admit that I'm not an expert in quasi-experimental design, but it would be nice to talk after this seminar to get more knowledge of that.
So, I'm sorry. So following up on Doug's question, I'm wondering why you didn't control for or use as an explanatory variable time of use tariff approval, right? Because the reason why utilities like smart meters is that they can price discriminate and charge people more for electricity when they need it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It improves their profit.
Yeah.
And so we have, like in Ohio, First Energy up in Cleveland uses smart meters. But there's no tariff approved in the state of Ohio that will allow them to charge more for electricity during peak demand.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, they installed it because they got paid to do it by federal funds, but they can't use it to profit from it. But in California, you have the opposite case. You have smart meters where they can charge you, you can go from 8 cents to 32 cents per kilowatt hour from off-peak to peak,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I guess the question is, if you're going to look at the count of adoption or an adoption in some way, why not look at the main financial motivator of utilities to adopt smart meters to begin with?
Right. I think the Public Service Commission ranking variable captures some of the part of the cost recovery mechanism. I think that's the only time variant variable that I can find for all the states. And you were talking about the time of use tariffs. Is it at the state level or it's at utility level, right? Yeah, I think that's one issue that I think it's always the problem. One major problem for this paper is how to aggregate some of the variable at the utility level to reflect that at the state level, especially when you think about the utility characteristics in terms of the ownership and the policy variable you talk about is also part of the utility heterogeneity among the group, right? How do you aggregate the from the utility level to the state level has always been a challenge for me. And one variable that I test is the percentage of investor-owned utility companies in each state. I mean, the market share of the investment-owned utility companies in each state. That kind of reflects about on the ownership type for each state. But that variable is not significant as well. So yeah, I could think about maybe including the energy efficiency resources standard at the state level. That might reflect some of the motivations for utility companies to invest in energy efficient technology.
What about just a dummy at the state level? PUC or PSC
Allows.
use rates?
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Any other questions? Yes.
I feel the need to follow up on the quasi-experimental thing. I think your answer to the question was right, that because this is really a test of federal policy, which is effective contingent on state policy, and there is no state policy effect without it, that's maybe why you wouldn't see from a quasi-experimental design any effect for state policy. But that statement, the question is a good one. So if you really want to inoculate yourself against that criticism, just do it, right? Your fixed effects, forget about the federal policy, and just look at pre and post at the state level. And if you see something there, then that means that your time trend didn't capture
very
the
well
the noise that you think it's capturing. So to get at her point, you do that, and then you backed up.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very useful. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a follow-up on the interaction term. Just when I see your result, it seems that federal policy was significant when it's used without interaction term, but when you add interaction terms, it's no longer significant. Because I think management and policy have different interpretation regarding the significance of the interaction term. Because in this case, the only interaction term is significant. And does that imply about the original coefficient, which is federal policy and state policy, they are not significant? And do we just interpret the interaction term? Or I know that there's sort of a disagreement in policy and management regarding the effect of that. I don't know how you respond.
Yeah, I think it's a great challenge to interpret the interaction term, and we should really be careful about that. And you can have different interpretations, and I'm choosing the one that I think that can support the hypothesis, which is that the state policy is actually the policy context, a broader policy context that influence the federal policy effects. And there's actually another explanation that you can go is a lot of the state level policy actions go hand in hand with the federal stimulus funding. So they coexist with stimulus funding. It's often the states that active at the state level adopting those policies, and these states, the utilities in these type of states are more likely to obtain the funding from the federal government. So it might also be this type of effects that's playing out in this technology diffusion process. Did I answer your question?
I wanted to follow up, just trying to figure out what you're saying. In this case, the federal policy, I don't remember what years you have, but it's zero for all the states, like the recovery funding.
Yes,
it's zero for all the states for the first year, right?
Yeah, it's from 2007 to 2012.
So what I think your variable is capturing is sort of a pre and post in a really crude way, right? Interacted with how much a state got is basically what your variable is capturing. So I think in this case, it's pre and post. So you know that there was no policy and suddenly there is a policy. So the interaction is a more straightforward interpretation than you're saying, correct?
Yeah, I just worry whether the raw coefficient has to be significant in order for the interaction term to be meaningful or not.
Oh, I see.
I think
So
the
Yeah.
I don't think so, because,
Yeah.
I mean,
And if it starts at zero, it's
yeah,
not a management.
I think there is some debate about whether the main effect needs to be significant as well as the interaction. That's the question you're asking, right?
Yeah.
But I think as long as the interaction effect is significant, because you can have a situation where both the moderator and the main effect are insignificant, but then when you have the interaction term, then you see the significance, right? So that would be a pure moderator situation. So in that case, I think it's fine. I think if there is a debate about it, I think it's a false debate because it doesn't make sense.
To that point about, can you talk a little bit more about your use of the number of policies as your measure of state policy? Noah kind of talked about a particular policy. David sort of asked the same question on the privacy side. What do you think you're picking up in terms of the number of policies versus other particular policies that maybe are more important? Did you think of other ways that you might have wanted to operate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So this is a long story. At the beginning, I only used the dummy variable to indicate whether a state has adopted policies in this area. But then when I look at the heterogeneity among the policy actions, because it's also backed up with the literature, you need not only consider the number, but also consider about the policy content. And that's why I try to categorize these two types of policy, and for each of them, it's indicating different directions for the state policy commitment. Yeah. And having a very simplified dummy variable showing whether states is working on this area is not very useful in the sense that it only captures, okay, the state has some action in that area, but it doesn't say anything about whether it's attitude, because for the way that I code this, I define and code these two policy variables, at least it shows some content, policy content. What are the topics that the state government is caring about? Yeah. Did I answer this question?
So, what would be your ideal measure if you?
That's a big, very big question. I think Dr. E has some publication and also has a lot of the debates in your paper regarding how you can categorize the policy output. Yeah, I think I don't think this is the question that I can answer at this moment with this short time, but I do have a bunch of the literature. If you are interested, I can send you. There's one by Schoffrain, which just look at how the different ways that you can categorize policy output and how that can improve the policy evaluation in the climate change policy area. So it's a very, a dynamic and developing policy theory area. I saw another hand somewhere.
I'm not going to get over this.
I enjoy your comments.
I have a strong opinion that diverges from my colleagues, so we'll talk about it.
Okay, any last questions?
Yes.
I have a question. So what was your theory behind the selection of those independent variables? Is it uncertainty? Is it profit maximization? What is it you're selecting those independent variables?
You mean for the policy variable alone?
In your understanding of what governance or bad governance brings to the problem of innovation, what's your underlying theory about how governance either facilitates or inhibits it?
That's a very good question. Actually, I didn't, the basis for this paper was not from the economics perspective, trying to analyze whether it's cost of reduction or profit maximization. It's more on the aggregate level or macro level of the policy diffusion. The thing that I do is I decided to focus just for the internal policy interaction terms that I mentioned before. Only focus on this smart meter and smart grid area and look at what are the large variation across the different states in terms of the policy activities.
Because I'm looking at some of these interaction effects and I'm wondering why are some significant and why are some not insignificant? And it would be interesting to have a theory to explain why that's the case, other than the fact that they're statistically significant or not.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on this? Maybe because it would be very useful to draw on the economics perspective.
Well, I mean, what do they say, right? Uncertainty is the biggest concern. Uncertainty is the biggest concern.
Right.
Of,
We
change
could
in
probably,
general, right?
yeah, we could probably link the data privacy with the uncertainty perspective.
Well, just one piece,
Yeah. That's a very good point. Thank you. Yes.
Question. Can you go back to your slide that has you got one slide where you're refreshing outputs? I think you included, but it wasn't in your regression outputs. I think you included.
Is this
price.
one? Yes, electricity price.
Yeah. How did that turn out as a result?
I think it's positive, significant. So you would see that states that are more likely to increase their electricity prices.
No,
And
it's potentially endogenous with your outcome measure.
can you say that again?
It's potentially endogenous now.
Do you see that explain the Public Service Commission?
Well, if you install smart meters that allow you to raise rates, why would you use prices to explain smart meter adoption?
Interesting. I would think the motivation for smart meters not only to be reducing the electricity
Sure,
rates,
environmental motives as
right?
well.
Because there are a lot more. I know some of the states are really concerned about the electricity itself,
Yeah.
so they want to be able to remotely disconnect some of the customers who do not pay bill. So I think the motivation could be like more diverse than just the price.
No doubt at all. I'm just asking about the effectiveness of using prices as a
Yeah.
control variable.
I thought about why it is a positive, significant, but do you have some
Did you think about maybe doing like a causality test or
for between
price
the,
and the amendment?
that would be interesting. I haven't done so though.
Great.
All right, now any last questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.